Okay, well, hello. I'm joined here at Hudson Institute for episode 17 of Making a Killing by our senior fellow, Marshall Billingslea. He was actually our first guest on the podcast, so welcome back, Marshall. He served under the Trump administration as a special envoy for arms control and the assistant secretary for terrorist financing at the Treasury Department. And prior to that, he served in the Bush administration in several really senior roles at the Defense Department, where he oversaw the US's special operations against Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups all around the world. So absolutely fantastic to have you here joining us again, Marshall, someone who was really one of the architects of the war on terror from a US point of view, to talk about the unfolding situation in Afghanistan, particularly from the point of view of what we look at on this podcast: illicit finance, corruption, kleptocracy, and so on. So just before we get onto those particular issues, though, I guess to kick us off, as someone, you were in the Pentagon on 9/11, and then, as we said, you went on to play this senior role in the Bush administration throughout the war on terror. What is your initial sort of reaction as a former government official to Biden's decision to withdraw so suddenly from Afghanistan, and just the abject chaos we're seeing in the way that's being implemented?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you, Nate. The past couple of weeks have been absolutely wrenching and heartbreaking. And to watch the President of the United States offer the American people this false dichotomy of a forever war versus how he has completely surrendered the country to the Taliban in the past 4 or 5 days was a disgrace, and a great many people are truly trying to cope with the situation we now face. There are many of us, like you said, who had direct hard experience at the hands of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and who have very strong feelings about this. So it's a tough situation for a lot of Americans and for a lot of our allies. I was really disappointed to see how the president has handled this with NATO, has treated key allies, including especially the British.
He hasn't treated them. He hadn't even spoken to another world leader till yesterday afternoon. I think
yesterday afternoon was the only call he's made. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure what's going on with him. There's something we don't know, but this deliberate isolation in the middle of this crisis, it's very confusing to a lot of people and very, very distressing to our friends and our allies.
No, sure. I can't begin to imagine. So moving on to our sort of topics for today, where we're going to look a bit about particularly at the Taliban themselves and how they fund themselves and so on. That's actually a good question to start with. Many people will be surprised, the world's wealthiest and most powerful country just sort of, lost in Afghanistan to what outwardly, when you look at them, look like a sort of ragtag bunch of militia. How is the Taliban funding itself? How is it supporting its operations throughout the past 20 years to the point where it was able to re-enter Kabul last week, victorious?
Well, it's a great question. I think the key here is to recognize how the United States military conducts operations with our allies and with our friends and with our partner nations like the Afghans, because the rapid collapse of the Afghan National Army is not to be blamed on the Afghans. It's to be blamed on the precipitous pullout in which we engaged that left them without all of the key infrastructure and integrative capability that the United States furnishes, not just to Afghanistan, but to our NATO allies. By design, and after 9/11 and after working on the Special Operations portfolio, I went to NATO as our Assistant Secretary General and participated in getting NATO into the fight in Afghanistan. And I will tell you that by design, the United States wants our friends and our allies to spend their precious resources on actual cutting-edge combat capability and to not try to duplicate the kinds of capabilities that we inevitably bring when we enter any given theater. And here I'm talking about logistics, I'm talking about air support, I'm talking about command and control and ISR capabilities. But when you rip that away suddenly from any partner nation, you render their combat capabilities largely ineffective. That's what we did to NATO. People are criticizing NATO for not rounding up 3,000 to 4,000 to 5,000 troops to backfill us in Afghanistan, and that is an unfair criticism. They could certainly round up the troops, but without all of that backing infrastructure that the United States provides, those troops would be ineffective. And the same proved to be the case with the Afghans. When we ripped away all of the support for aviation, all of the support for logistics, it's no surprise that the Afghans collapsed as quickly as they did. What is surprising is this administration's complete and abject failure to understand that that is exactly what would happen. You asked about Taliban's finances, and I tell you, we are entering a very, very dark period. When you look back at these same people, Jake Sullivan, our Secretary of State, these are the same people who deliberately participated in the abrupt and precipitous pullout and cut and run from Iraq in 2011, which gave rise to Daesh and the ISIS caliphate. At the height of the caliphate in Iraq, they were bringing in around $2 billion a year. From all sorts of things, extortion, kidnapping, in their case, oil.
Yep.
The Taliban, which was until very recently an insurgency, was bringing in about $1.6 billion a year. In their case, not oil, but mining. They were selling a lot of illegal and illicit mining products, copper and other things, to the Chinese and the Emiratis. So we're dealing now with an insurgency that has taken over a territory far greater than what ISIS had at the height of their caliphate. And they are well resourced, and the results will be catastrophic for us and our friends and our allies.
Well, just building on that, one of the aspects many people are quite surprised to sort of find if they don't follow these issues. They think of the Taliban as very strict Islamic religious sort of theocracy, theocratic sort of oriented organization. But I saw an article recently, I can't remember who wrote it, unfortunately, describing that Afghanistan is also about to become Central Asia's first narco state. Is the drugs problem in Afghanistan going to get worse or better under the Taliban?
Oh, goodness, it's going to be off the charts. The Taliban is already by far and away the world's largest producer of heroin. But they've been diversifying into methamphetamines, and we will see, that $1.6 billion that I mentioned in terms of their revenue stream, around $400 million or so, it's estimated, or greater, of that was the drug trade. In fact, what the Taliban was doing was increasingly centralizing and solidifying the complete end-to-end supply chain process associated with heroin. In the past, a lot of the reprocessing and processing was being done in Pakistan, but the Taliban was increasingly building the capability to do it on its own, and therefore to hold on to all of that revenue stream. So we are going to see the drug production skyrocket, and we will see diversification into all kinds of additional drug products, like I mentioned, like meth.
You mentioned that they were processing this stuff in Pakistan. Pakistan is widely reported to have been a strong financial supporter of the Taliban. Do you agree with that? What is the situation? What is the relationship there?
A relationship between the Taliban and elements of the Pakistani intelligence service are very close and very tight. And it has been a repeated failure of the United States, stretching back to the Bush administration. To my time in the Pentagon, a repeated failure of every administration to sever that link between the Pakistani service and the Taliban, and we are seeing the results of that today.
No, sure. So they've got these billions of dollars, perhaps growing into many billions of dollars now that they're in charge of the whole country. How do you anticipate that the Taliban is going to use these resources? Are they going to be building roads and schools and hospitals, or are they going to be using it to launch a new global jihad? Terrorism financing and so on. What will their priorities be if they are able to form a working government going forward?
Well, it certainly won't be hospitals. When we stepped into Afghanistan in 2001, 2002, we witnessed firsthand how women were treated, giving birth literally in the streets under their demented view of Sharia law. You simply cannot have contact with a woman in those kinds of situations. So the money won't go to those kinds of activities. It will certainly not go to educating young girls. It will not go to the arts. In fact, we're going to see the Museum of Kabul looted, if it hasn't already been, and all of that being sold on the black market.
Yeah.
I think suffice to say, the Obama-Biden team created the Islamic Caliphate, allowed it to happen with their withdrawal in Iraq. Now the Biden-Harris team has created the Islamic Emirate in Afghanistan. The Caliphate, ISIS that whole organization, that $2 billion they had a year, they spread it around and created cells and networks all over the world, and especially in Africa. I see nothing to suggest that the Taliban will not do the same. We are on the verge of a rapid metastasizing of this terrorist cancer. In addition, we will see al-Qaeda come roaring back in full force. There is no difference between the Taliban and al-Qaeda. The deputy emir of the Taliban, Haqqani, is an al-Qaeda, is a avowed al-Qaeda member. So we will see the people who visited 9/11 upon this nation reestablish a firm foothold in Afghanistan, and the plotting and the preparation, begins anew.
Not much to look forward to, it seems. What kind of, the Taliban is one of the world's premier funders of terrorism. It's also going to be the government of a sovereign state, if you can call it that. It's clearly a failed state, to my mind. How does that work in terms of what their diplomatic relations might be going forward? So, the US has been an all-consuming presence in Afghanistan for the past 20 years. With the vacuum that our withdrawal creates, are we likely to see the Taliban develop relationships with some of our strategic adversaries, for example, Russia or China, or will they become a sort of a satellite? Will they become closely beholden to Pakistan and their objectives? What do you think their sort of foreign policy is, so to speak, besides a global, the return to global jihadism? What does that look like? Have we ceded influence? Well, we've obviously ceded influence, but who is going to move into that, if anyone? Or will Afghanistan become a sort of isolated, sort of criminal, sort of narco terrorist state in the middle of this sort of very difficult part of the world?
Well, time will tell, but I think it's clear that this is not a group that can be treated as a legitimate government. And we should not tolerate any nation that seeks to engage with them as such. Certainly, I think the Russians have a long experience with Afghanistan, not a healthy one, and there's a lot of different factors and calculations that they will have. I think the Chinese will be most interested, as they are around the world, largely in the raw material, the resources, the mining in Afghanistan, and we're going to need to be very firm with the Chinese on this topic. But let's remember that in addition to the U.S. perspective on this, the Taliban remains under UN sanctions, multiple sanctions that date back to 1999, starting with UN Security Council Resolution 1267. They are a pariah. They are viewed, and rightly so, by the international community and under international law as a terrorist organization. And any transactions with them, any dealings with them in terms of assets or facilitation of travel is explicitly forbidden under UN's multiple different UN Security Council resolutions. So it's going to fall to the key members of the Security Council. And here, unfortunately, I don't think I can look to this Biden administration to enforce those resolutions, but certainly our British and French colleagues should take every step to strengthen the Security Council resolutions and at a minimum to prevent their watering down, whether it's by the Russians or the Chinese or unfortunately the Americans.
Well, that's good, but that sort of brings us to the sort of last stage of our discussion, which is, what we always try to talk about in the podcast. What can we do about it? What should the appropriate response be? Because lots of people sort of talk about problems, and we clearly have a huge problem on our hand that's trying and get to some solutions. So from what we've heard from the president and his team, it seems like they are putting their faith in multilateral diplomacy. America is back. Rooms full of Europeans giving them standing ovations. And
I don't think they're getting any ovations from Europe.
Not for this,
no.
Not anymore.
Yeah.
But they believe that by being friendly with allies, they will fall in line with the U.S. leadership, and also they're going to be relying on US sanctions and economic statecraft to try and keep the Taliban in check. Will that be enough? I mean, what will these measures? You mentioned the sanctions and stuff, the UN sanctions, but how powerful can economic statecraft measures like sanctions be against an organization like the Taliban? Is it enough to keep them in check?
No, not at all. The Taliban's been living under the most fulsome set of sanctions the world has for more than 20 years. And to think that this administration can suddenly pivot to sanctions when frankly, they have been anti-sanction on every matter. They have suspended all of the enforcement mechanisms against the Iranians, against the Venezuelans. So for them to throw that out rings hollow to many of us. I also will say when you listen to the President of the United States talk, he so glibly talks about an over-the-horizon counterterrorism capability. I don't know who's feeding him that, but having firsthand experience with how that works, that is far easier said than done, particularly in a geography the size of Texas, with no bases remotely close at this stage. So I believe that we're entering into a phase where we will see a resurgence of al-Qaeda, and with the infrastructure that's associated with the ability to conduct worldwide terror attacks. This is, as I've said, because of Biden's cut and run behavior, inexplicable in my mind. We're entering a very, very dark period, and our children and likely now our grandchildren will be coping with this.
Is there anything that can be done? If snap your fingers and Marshall Billingslea's back in the Treasury tomorrow, what would be the best? This is a worst case scenario in every way imaginable. But how would you approach this problem? How would you try and mitigate the damage that's been done without this presence in the country?
So I will say our friends at the U.S. Treasury have been doing a heroic job. But we're dealing with an administration that does not operate like a normal administration. They don't build consensus, and they don't solicit views outside of sort of an imperial National Security Council staff. If they had, I think they wouldn't have been blindsided the way they have been. That said, the Treasury has taken all of the right steps in recent days, particularly to lock down the foreign reserves that the Afghan central bank holds largely in the United States. We're talking about more than $9 billion here.
I remember at one point there was a concern about the reserves in hard currency that were being held at the Central Bank of Afghanistan. Do you have any sort of update on what?
Well, I can't sort of get into the particulars, but I would say that the Treasury did all the right things, and we avoided a catastrophic situation where the Taliban could have swarmed the bank and the presidential palace and potentially had access to hundreds of millions of dollars in actual physical banknotes. That said, the Taliban has already raided the central bank looking for the governor. The governor has managed to get himself out by his own storytelling, no thanks to us. But they clearly are looking for ways to access those reserves. So I think that there are a number of things that need to happen immediately. The first is that while the administration is saying all the right things with regard to Taliban finances, this is the same administration during their confirmation hearings that multiple cabinet officials promised senators that they would not remove terrorism sanctions on the Iranians. And the moment they were installed in office, they immediately set about to do exactly that. So there can't be any trust here. It's going to be essential for the Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Menendez needs to step up with Ranking Member Risch. And we need to see bipartisan legislation on this topic. To start with, we need to see legislation that locks down those reserves and gives no discretion to this administration in terms of how that money is handled. But we need to go further. The Taliban, it's long overdue that the Taliban be designated as a foreign terrorist organization, and their recent behavior and the moment we have our military out of Kabul, I think you will see horrific horrific activities. Summary executions are already happening across the country. Yeah. This is a group that needs to be designated as a foreign terrorist organization, and Afghanistan as a whole as a state sponsor of terrorism. And we need to go further. The drug trafficking needs to be highlighted and needs to be subject to our sort of kingpin type authorities that we employ. And all of this needs to be done with an eye towards signaling to Russia and China that we will not tolerate these countries stepping in and buttressing this terror apparatus. I think the Chinese need to be very careful. Afghanistan, borders on Xinjiang, and they engage with these people at great risk themselves, and I think they may know that. But we're in a pretty rough. We're going to go through a rough patch here.
Yeah. You mentioned the governor of the central bank had managed to get himself out without casting any aspersions on him personally. I don't know about him. But one of the concerns. I mean, we're going to look at next week's episode more about what went wrong in Afghanistan from the point of view of the corruption of the government and the US's role in perhaps sometimes exacerbating that, or efforts to tackle it. But what we're starting to see is these senior Afghan officials. Many of them face pretty horrific allegations of corruption and bear a large part of the blame for the disappearance of all the resources that were handed to them. Some of them are now sort of fleeing across the border. There's a report, I haven't seen it confirmed particularly well, that President Ashraf Ghani appeared in Uzbekistan with $169 million in cash. I don't know if that's true or not. I think that came from the Russians, so we have to take everything with a pinch of salt. But we are going to see probably inevitably former senior Afghan officials popping up, perhaps in Western capitals, with wealth of uncertain origin, shall we say? How do you think we should deal with them now? There isn't sort of the need to sort of indulge them for political reasons to prop up their government. Should they be welcomed as sort of experts on the situation, or should we be sort of looking at their assets? If you were at DOJ, for example.
The corruption of the Afghan leadership is legion. It goes back to Hamid Karzai and his brother, who was heavily involved in the narcotics trade, and Karzai covered for him at every step of the way. And the United States and, frankly, our allies are not blameless in this regard. I would, certainly commend the reporting that the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, so-called SIGAR, SIGAR, for those who want to look it up online. It's worth reading how U.S. funds were repeatedly diverted into corruption channels. We need to learn from this because the same pattern of behavior was replicated in Iraq with reconstruction efforts there, and there should be no toleration of that, and in particular in the case of Ghani. Now, when it comes to the central bank governor, I don't want to associate him in any respect with this. My experience at the Treasury, and I think that of my successor, was genuinely very positive working with the Afghanistan Bank, DAB as it's called, which is the central bank, and with their financial intelligence unit called Fintraka. These were upright Afghans, and I think we need to be careful not to cast broad aspersions across the entire government. There are many, many honorable Afghans who served for their country and who are now fleeing for their lives.
No, absolutely. No, and I didn't mean to cast aspersions on anyone in particular. We're coming to sort of the end of our questions here, but Marshall, is there anything you wanted to sort of concluding thoughts on the situation and what, we've already talked about what should happen next, but just reflections on the past couple of weeks, particularly from the view of what comes next in terms of illicit finance.
We'll have to see. The United States was, in my view, over the past year and a half, taking the right steps to pivot towards an Asia focus, with China in particular, as we have seen their massive buildup in their nuclear arsenal, and as they have gotten increasingly aggressive with generally speaking, every nation on their periphery. Mm-hmm. The abdication of any leadership and any responsibility in Afghanistan by the Biden-Harris administration has led to, like I've said, the establishment of an Islamic emirate that is the size of Texas, that has already as many resources as ISIS had at its height, and the potential to greatly expand its ability to export Islamic jihadism around the world. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I think that means that this recalibration cannot happen in full. Mm-hmm. We will now have to continue to invest far greater resources and capability into the counterterrorism fight than we would have had if we had continued to keep a check on the Taliban through the mechanisms we had. Mm-hmm. This isn't the false dichotomy that the president tried to present to the American people, which I don't think anybody really believed. It's not about a forever war. Yeah. But the manner of the exit, mm-hmm. the way we treated our allies, and the way the president, on the one hand, said, he takes full responsibility, the buck stops here, and then proceeded to blame everyone else for the situation, is unacceptable. And so repairing the damage he has done with our NATO allies, mm-hmm. Our international credibility, this becomes of paramount importance. We have 3 years and 4 months to go mm-hmm. under this crowd. Yep. And so I think every effort to just hold the line until we can get real, serious policymakers back mm-hmm. into the government to repair this damage.
Marshall, thank you so much for your time today. We've hit half an hour pretty much precisely. So thank you for your insights and reflections at this very difficult time. This is a podcast about corruption and kleptocracy. It's never going to be great fun. Though we try to bring a little liveliness to it with my partners Casey and Paul, but just nothing but terrible feelings this week after what's happened, and indeed what we are looking forward to in terms of an even more serious threat in the world for us, our children, and our grandchildren. So thank you, though, Marshall, for your time.
Thanks for having me.
And we hope to have you back again soon.
You bet. Good to be with you.